This is the Words of West Cork podcast. It's a podcast where you'll hear something like this.
But my instinct is if I had nothing to do with the thing I was being accused of, I'm not going to remain silent.
And we'll analyse it using only the words we hear, and we'll discuss whether what we hear is truth or lies. What we're going to see if we can get an insight into is the events surrounding the murder of Sophie Toscan du Plantier in West Cork in December of 1996. And we're going to do that by looking at the words of the people at the centre of the investigation. Now, the fact Sophie was murdered feels to me like that's where the facts end here. She was murdered. There was a local man called Ian Bailey, who was identified as a prime suspect. Lots of people said lots of things, but factually, there's not a lot. I recommend, if you haven't already, listening to the podcast West Cork, which deals with this case. There's a Netflix documentary called Sophie Murder in West Cork, and there's a Sky crime documentary called Murder at the Cottage. All cover the story brilliantly. Having watched those, my personal feeling was there's quite a lot that points to that guy, Ian Bailey, but it is nearly all circumstantial evidence. He denies he had anything to do with the murder. Now, there is a lot of circumstantial evidence, but there's also circumstantial evidence that the investigation by the police was botched. There's just very little facts involved in this, so I'm going to be open-minded when I analyse the words. But I will say right now that I do find Ian Bailey an extremely suspicious person. However, what we do when we look at someone's words is we take everything they say at face value and assume nothing. And we look at the words they actually say to see if we can discover signs of deception or weaknesses in the words. And this podcast looks only at the words we hear. We won't look at the facts, we won't look at theories, we won't examine the evidence, we won't look at body language, only the words we hear. And I'm going to use 3 principles as I go. The first principle is that in general, people don't like to lie, so we will do everything to avoid lying if we possibly can. That might mean only telling a very limited version of the truth or even saying nothing, but we will try and avoid lying. For example, if someone says to you, "Where were you last night?" and you don't want to tell them where you were last night, but you also don't want to lie, you'll say something slightly evasive like, "I was out." Or you might say something even more evasive like, "Why are you asking?" In both cases, whether you've said, "I was out," or you've said, "Why are you asking?" you haven't answered the question, "Where were you last night?" but at the same time, you haven't told any lies. The next principle is that people pick the words they most want to use. In 90% of our lives, it's a subconscious picking those words for us. But every now and again, we want to carefully select the words we use. And that's most likely what's going on here in the words we listen to, because people they're talking about a delicate situation. They're talking about a murder. So they'll be carefully selecting the words to make sure that what we hear, what they say, is the right thing, the thing they want to say. And that holds whether they are telling the truth or whether they are telling lies. But from knowing that people pick the right words to use, we can get an impression of what is the truth, and we can also learn what is important to the person who is talking. For example, if you say to me, "What did you have for tea tonight?" and I reply to you, "I had garlic spaghetti for tea tonight," that's fairly truthful. It must be. It's really straightforward. I've told you what, I've told you who, and I've told you when. If I said to you, "I made myself a beautiful garlic spaghetti tonight, but I ate it on my own," I've told you a hell of a lot more. I've told you it was beautiful. I told you I made it myself. I told you I ate it on my own. Why did I tell you those things? And what if you asked me what I had for tea tonight and I went, "Not much"? Why were those the words I picked? We can look at the words that people use and we can work out where the truth is, and we can work out what is important to those people. The third principle is that when people do deceive us in words, they tend to use one of around about 20 different tactics, and we can spot those tactics in play. What I will say to you is if someone does use deceptive language, if we spot someone using deceptive language when they hear their words, that doesn't make them a liar, and certainly in this case, it doesn't make them party to a murder. However, the more of those deceptive indicators that we spot in someone's words, then the more likely it is that they are misleading us or deceiving us. And that's when we're going to start to dig. And the other thing we can do when we're using those 3 principles is we can detect when someone's telling the truth. If all that sounds quite complex and theoretical, well, first of all, it kind of is. And secondly, do not worry, I'll explain what we're doing as I go along. You can see the words for each episode online at wordsofwestcork.com, which is also where you can get in touch to comment on what you hear, to ask questions or make suggestions. But you may find it easy, if you can, to read the words and look at the words as we listen to them and as we talk about them. So across the series, we're going to look at the words from the people close to the investigation. We'll look at witnesses, the police, and we're going to start with that prime suspect, Ian Bailey. And in this episode, we're going to look at a lot of the words that Ian Bailey said then, just after the murder. In the podcasts and documentaries that we've spoken about, he's had a lot of time to practice his story. He's had a lot of time to think about what it is he wants to say. And he's told his story so many times, he's probably fallen into some routines when he's talking about it. Back in the day, shortly after the murder, he hadn't told the story so many times and he hadn't had quite as much time to think. So I'm hoping that what we're going to hear will be raw. It'll be fresher. Ian Bailey was arrested by the police on suspicion of murder and released without charge. And we're going to start off with a couple of interviews that he gave round about that time.
It was made absolutely certain to me by all my interrogating officers that I was the murderer. They had no doubt. They knew it was me. They just needed me to confess. But I can account for all of my movements during the period. If they had evidence, I wouldn't be here talking to you. I wouldn't have been released.
Yeah. Well,
I know I'm innocent. I have nothing to do with this killing.
The first thing to know about Ian Bailey is he works with words. So he was a journalist at the time and he fancied himself as a bit of a poet. So he is aware of how words can be used to paint pictures and give impressions. So sometimes his words may be flowerier than other people are using, or he may use bigger words than other people were using. Now, there's some reassuring things in what we've heard there. He talks about interrogating officers. He talks about a murder and he talks about a killing. And that's quite reassuring because often when people are accused of doing something quite severe, quite serious, and they have done it, when they're talking about it, they'll use their language to downplay it. So rather than talking about a killing, for example, they'll say, I had nothing to do with this crime. They will talk about maybe just this. They will try and use language to downplay it. So instead of Ian Bailey saying I was the interrogating officers were convinced I was the murderer, if someone was downplaying that, they might say the interrogating officers knew I did it or were convinced I did it. Ian Bailey doesn't do any of that downplaying. He uses the words murderer and killing. That's quite reassuring. He does not seek to downplay the severity. I can start to see some picture painting in his words here. He's trying to paint himself out as a victim. And if you've been accused of a murder, your first instinct generally will be to get yourself off being accused of being a murderer. You will want to get rid of the accusation. That's a very serious accusation. It won't be your biggest priority to portray yourself as a victim. Your biggest priority will be, this was not me that did this. Some words that do worry me in this are when he says, they had no doubt, they knew it was me. They just needed me to confess. Now, if you hadn't done it, if you were being accused of something you hadn't done, would you say the words, they knew it was me, they just needed me to confess? Or are you more likely to say, they thought it was me and they wanted me to confess? I think you would. I think actually saying they knew it was me and they needed me to confess is a big indicator, a red flag that somewhere in his words, he's not softening this, he's not qualifying that down. He could think that he is quoting the interrogators verbatim, but I would phrase it, and I would expect to hear from an innocent person it phrased differently. Now, next in Ian Bailey's words are, it's something we'll see a lot. Instead of saying, I didn't do it, I am not a murderer, I did not kill this woman, or I did not kill Sophie, he talks about his innocence in conceptual terms, which is really interesting. So rather than give outright denials, he says, I know I'm innocent. He doesn't just say, I did not do this. It's, I know I'm innocent and I had nothing to do with this killing. It's completely different from an outright, straight, hard, I did not do this denial. He talks a lot about what he knows as well, Ian Bailey, rather than what he did or what he didn't do. I'm interested in why he says, I can account for all my movements during the period. Now, number one, that is not the same thing as I did not murder Sophie, but I can account for all my movements during the period. Well, number one, that's quite qualified. He doesn't say I can account for all my movements. It's only he can account for all my movements during the period. So if there's any discrepancies in anyone's timelines, then we've got a bit of a problem going on there, don't we? And then again, I can account for all my movements. No, I didn't do it. It's just these are weaker denials than they could be. He stutters when he says, I know I'm innocent. When we stutter, there's words that are causing us stress or thoughts that are causing us stress. When we stutter on I, because we're saying the word I, we're really at a very base level bonding ourselves to what we're going to say next. And he stutters on I'm innocent. That's very interesting. That is a bit of a marker. And the other thing is, he says, if they had evidence, I wouldn't be here talking to you. Not there is no evidence, so I'm here talking to you, but it's if they had evidence, I wouldn't be here talking to you. Conceptually, he thinks there could be evidence when he says that, because he doesn't say there is no evidence, which is why I'm here talking to you. It's if they had evidence talking to you. So in the very first thing we've heard from Ian Bailey, there are some reassuring things that he says, but there is a lot to worry about, especially there is just no really strong, hard denial. I did not murder.
It was made absolutely certain to me by all my interrogating officers that I was the murderer. They had no doubt. They knew it was me. They just needed me to confess. But I can account for all of my movements during the period. If they had evidence, I wouldn't be here talking to you. I wouldn't have been released.
Yeah. Well,
I know I'm innocent. I have nothing to do with this killing.
Next up is another clip from Ian, around about the same time, potentially the same day.
Well, for 12 hours, I was subjected to a barrage of questioning from different officers, between 10 to a dozen officers. There was one common theme that went on throughout this, that they knew that I was the killer. They were convinced.
Did you know Sophie Toscan du Plantier?
I didn't know her, in as much that I had never met her, but I had seen her once and she was pointed out to me.
But you're saying to me here, you didn't kill Sophie du Plantier, nor did you have any part in that.
I am saying to you that I didn't kill her, I had no knowledge of the killing, and I'm an innocent man.
Similar themes in that, certainly victimhood. So he talks about 12 hours subjected to a barrage of questioning from different officers, between 10 to a dozen officers. So again, he's painting this picture of one man against the might of the police force. Certainly some picture painting in there as well, the barrage of questioning, 10 to a dozen officers. And once again, there was that line there that they knew I was the killer. He says that line again. That's the second time he said they knew I was the killer. Not they were telling me that they thought I was the killer, or they were sure I was the killer, or they were convinced I was the killer. It's they knew I was the killer. Now, knowledge pops up a lot in Ian Bailey's words. Here, he's saying they knew I was the killer. He does say killer, though. That's reassuring. That goes back to my thing about him not downplaying what he is accused of. He does talk about them accusing him of being the killer, not the person responsible, or they knew I'd done this. He says, I was the killer. He's then asked, did you know Sophie Toscan du Plantier? And he says, I didn't know, in as much that I'd never met her, but I'd seen her once and she was pointed out to me. Now, that's not a no. It's not a yes either. It's a yes-no question. Did you know Sophie Toscan du Plantier? Yes, I did. No, I didn't. He sort of tries to say no, but he qualifies it quite a lot. He's asked, did you know Sophie Toscan du Plantier? And he replies with this really qualified answer. I didn't know, in as much as that I'd never met her, but I'd seen her once and she was pointed out to me. That's like you saying to me, hey, have you been to Atlanta? And my reply is, well, I haven't been to Atlanta in as much as, well, I have been to the airport, but I've not been to the city. When really what you would expect to come back when you say to me, have you been to Atlanta, is me saying, never been to the city, but I have been to the airport. That's just a much more straightforward answer, and it's straightforward, uncomplicated, unqualified answers that we expect to hear when someone is being truthful. And again, no comes up with Ian Bailey's words. What does it mean to know someone? I know George Clooney. I know how he works. I know he's married. I know where he lives. I know what he looks like. I know some of the things that he believes in. But if you said to me, do you know George Clooney? I'd probably say no. we're complete strangers, me and you. So if you said to me, do you know my best friend? I'd just come straight out and say, no, I don't know your best friend. But Ian Bailey can't say he did not know. He just can't say, no, I didn't know her. He says, I didn't know her in as much as I'd never met her. And then he says, but I'd seen her once and she was pointed out to me. Now, the ordering there is really strange. Why not, I saw her once when she was pointed out to me? It's two different things. I'd seen her once and she was pointed out to me. So on ordering there, she was pointed out to him after he saw her. So does that mean he saw her, made some remark and someone went, oh, that's Sophie? Or did he make some other remark? Or did he see her twice? Very, very interesting, that ordering. I'd seen her once and she was pointed out to me. Interesting. It's then said to him, but you're saying to me you didn't kill Sophie du Plantier, nor did you have any part in that. And he replies, I'm saying to you that I didn't kill her. I had no knowledge of the killing and I am an innocent man. Once again, we see the words kill and we see the words killing in here, reassuring things. He's not downplaying the severity. He's not trying to downplay what he's being accused of. But we're back to this concept of innocence and guilt again. But he does say, I didn't kill her. But then he says, I had no knowledge of the killing and I'm an innocent man. I had no knowledge. What is he denying here? He's denying having knowledge of the crime. One of the reasons that the police were suspicious of him was that he turned up to the scene of the crime as a journalist to report on it. But much earlier than the police were expecting anyone to turn up, they felt like he had some inside knowledge this crime had happened. That could be what he is denying there. But also, I had no knowledge of the killing. Well, if someone was launching some sort of insanity defense, those could be the words that they would use. And this could not be what he's doing, but it could be some sort of internal justification. I had no knowledge of the crime. But also, someone who's saying their amnesia, they don't remember what happened. They also would have no knowledge of a crime that they committed. Now, I wasn't there. I can't say what happened, but I do know that the words, I had no knowledge of the crime, can be used in some self-justifying way by someone who committed a crime but is claiming insanity or amnesia. And if the justification is, I had no knowledge, well, what are some of the things that could cause that no knowledge? For example, I have no knowledge of that thing that happened that wild Friday night when I was 21, had way too much to drink. I know now that things did happen, but I have no knowledge of them.
Well, for 12 hours I was subjected to a barrage of questioning from different officers, between 10 to a dozen officers. There was one common theme that went on throughout this, that they knew that I was the killer. They were convinced.
Did you know Sophie Toscan du Plantier?
I didn't know her, in as much that I had never met her, but I had seen her once and she was pointed out to me.
But you're saying to me here, you didn't kill Sophie du Plantier, nor did you have any part in that.
I am saying to you that I didn't kill her, I had no knowledge of the killing, and I'm an innocent man.
The West Cork podcast had the genius idea of sticking together 3 parts of interviews that Ian Bailey did, all about, did he know Sophie Toscan du Plantier? Have a listen to these. You'll recognise one of them. We've already heard it.
Had you any previous knowledge of this woman? Had you met her before? Were you acquainted with her? Had you seen her before?
I had never met her. I had never been introduced to her. I had never spoken to her.
Did you know Sophie Toscan du Plantier?
I didn't know her, in as much that I had never met her, but I had seen her once and she was pointed out to me.
Did you know? Connaissiez-vous Sophie Toscan du Plantier?
Never met her, never spoken with her. I'd seen her on one occasion, and it was pointed out by a neighbour.
3 times he's asked if he knew her or had knowledge of her, and 3 times his reply is, I'd never met her. In fact, it's the first thing that he really says in 2 of those 3 answers. I'd never met her. I didn't know her in as much as I'd never met her. Did you know her? Never met her. It's really important for him to get across the fact that he'd never met her. He doesn't actually only once does he deal with the, did you know her? He only says, I never met her. So it's very important for him, whether he's slightly dodging the question or whether he just wants to make sure that we know he never met her. But whatever it is, in those 3 questions and answers that we heard, he doesn't give a very straight and direct answer. And also he brings more into it. So he's asked, did you have any previous knowledge? Had you met her? Were you acquainted with her? Had you seen her before? And he says, I'd never met her, never been introduced to her, never spoken to her. He wasn't asked if he'd spoken to her or being introduced to her. But he brings these things in. Again, on the second one, never met her, never spoken with her. You were only asked, did you know her, but never met her, never spoken to her. And when someone says more in reply to a question, when they give you more information than you've asked for, it's very important for them to be getting these things across. So why is telling us these things important to Ian Bailey? And again, he does this strange ordering thing. I'd seen her on one occasion and it was pointed out by a neighbour. Ian Bailey said in the answer that we'd heard previously, I'd seen her once and she was pointed out to me, and I'd seen her on one occasion and it was pointed out by a neighbour. I wonder now if he's seen her many, many more times, but there's only one time where he saw her where there was an actual witness to the fact that he had seen her, and which is why he feels he needs to talk about that occasion. He needs to say there was the occasion where he'd seen her and it was pointed out by a neighbour. Twice he says he's never spoken to her. I get the feeling he's seen her a lot more times than just that one occasion. He's very sensitive around this because he doesn't answer the question in a straightforward manner. I think he maybe knew of her rather than knew her, like as in had any sort of relationship with her, even just one in passing. I think that is what is going on there. And also some of what he's talking about here. So I'm going into what I think is being suggested out here. He knew her or knew of her. He was aware of her. He'd never met her, but I think he'd seen her on more than one occasion. That feels to me like stalking. I believe that what is being described here could be stalking, and these could be words that would be used by a stalker talking about them carrying out their stalking.
Had you any previous knowledge of this woman? Had you met her before? Were you acquainted with her? Had you seen her before?
I had never met her. I had never been introduced to her. I had never spoken to her.
Did you know Sophie Toscan du Plantier?
I didn't know her in as much that I had never met her, but I had seen her once and she was pointed out to me.
Did you know? Connaissiez-vous Sophie Toscan du Plantier?
Never met her, never spoken with her. I'd seen her on one occasion and it was pointed out by a neighbour.
More recently, Ian Bailey has been asked the same question. How well did he know Sophie?
And I saw somebody in the house who I think may have been her from a distance. I'd never seen her at any close range.
It was all through a window and...
Yes, and no detail, I wouldn't have known who she was. I wouldn't have been able to pick her out, for instance, and I wouldn't have known her.
So when you saw her picture in the paper subsequently, that was the first time you'd even seen her face?
Didn't ring any bells at all.
He's changed his story now, because previously when he was talking about it at the time, it was pointed out that the person he saw in the house was Sophie. But red flag for deception here, he's changed his story because he says, and I saw somebody in the house who I think may have been her from a distance. No, you knew it was Sophie. You were told it was Sophie, and you've told us 3 times or twice previously that you saw Sophie in the house. Now, 20 plus years on, you only think it may have been her. And very, very keen to say there was no closeness here. He says, it may have been her from a distance. I never seen her at any close range. He's then asked, this is all through a window, and he says, yes, and no detail. So again, he's talking about distance. I wouldn't have known who she was. Why is it important for you to say this? Why is all this distance and this unrecognizability important for you to get across? I wouldn't have been able to pick her out, for instance, in... He stops himself there and he goes on to say something else. He goes on to say, I wouldn't have known her. Well, pick her out where, when? For instance, I'd love to know what it was he was going to say there and thought better of saying, pick her out. I mean, I worry about this. Previously, when we listened to his words at the time, he was keen to be saying that he'd never met her, never spoken to her. And now he's saying He's only seen her, but at a distance, and certainly in no detail. There was, I think it may have been her. This description, 20 plus years on from the murder, is much, much more vague than what was there at the time. Next, something I really don't like. The interviewer says, so when you saw her picture in the paper subsequently, that was the first time. And he's got his answer ready because he cuts this question off in half and comes in with an answer because he knows this is planned. This is what he wants to say. I didn't ring any bells at all. Now, that's really deceptive because Ian Bailey was writing for papers at the time, and he was writing about this murder for papers at the time. So when he saw the picture in the paper subsequently, he knew who it was. But he doesn't really answer the question. He just says it didn't ring any bells because he is so keen to say he didn't see Sophie close up that he has to say it didn't ring any bells at all. I get what he's trying to say. What he is trying to say is when I saw her picture in the papers, that was the first time I'd seen her features close up. But he doesn't say that. He says it doesn't ring any bells at all, which suggests to me, I mean, I feel in all of this, there is a lot of deception going on in the words. I think, again, he was a keen student of Sophie Toscan du Plantier.
And I saw somebody in the house who I think may have been her from a distance. I'd never seen her at any close range.
It was all through a window and...
Yes, and no detail, no... I wouldn't have known who she was. I wouldn't have been able to pick her out, for instance, I wouldn't have known her.
So when you saw her picture in the paper subsequently, that was the first time you'd even seen her face?
Didn't ring any bells at all.
We've had a lot of words of Ian Bailey to look at in this episode, a lot of them from round about the time that he was arrested for the first time and he was first being accused of this murder. And he gave a lot of interviews at the time, and he's asked why did he give a lot of interviews at the time. And this is his answer.
But my instinct is if I had nothing to do with the thing I was being accused of, I'm not going to remain silent.
My instinct is if I had nothing to do with the thing I was being accused of, I'm not going to remain silent. Now it's being downplayed. This is Ian Bailey talking now. The thing I was being accused of, not anymore a murder, not anymore being a killer. Now he's downplaying the severity. Some of those things that I found reassuring at the time, now being downplayed. I had nothing to do with the thing I was being accused of. But listen to the if. My instinct is if I had nothing to do with the thing I was being accused of. Not my instinct is as I had nothing to do with the thing I was being accused of, I'm not going to remain silent. He says my instinct is if I had nothing to do with the thing I was being accused of. That very much sounds to me like the thought process of someone who is guilty and they're thinking, well, if I was innocent, what would I do? If I had nothing to do with this, how would I behave? What would I do? This, if I had nothing to do with the thing I was being accused of, I'm not going to remain silent, sounds like the vocalized thought process of a guilty person thinking, if I was innocent, then how would I behave? What would I do in this situation if I was innocent? Not words I liked at all.
But my instinct is if I had nothing to do with the thing I was being accused of, I'm not going to remain silent.
So that's the words of Ian Bailey. So what are my conclusions? Well, as I've said, there are some reassuring factors, especially in the early day. He didn't downplay the severity of what he was accused of, and I explained why that is reassuring. Also, there's something that I didn't mention because it's not something that happened, and that's he didn't try to overly explain why he was innocent. He didn't try and come up with complicated reasons or rationales why it could not have been him. He kept it fairly simple. But on the other hand, there is a lot to worry about. There's the things like where he said they knew I was the killer. Now, one or two of these things can just be slips, they can just be misspeaks, but there are so many of these things, so many signs of deception that it really worries me. There's also the fact that he's very qualified and very precise when talking about how well or how little he knew Sophie, how many times he'd seen her. Which makes me wonder, was he stalking Sophie, which we've already spoken about? And number two, Is he building up some self-justification, which is why he keeps talking about, I know I'm innocent, I have no knowledge of the killing. Is he building up a self-justification so that if something else was to come to light, he can say, no, look, I've already told you, I don't know about this, I have no knowledge of this. I think that's very possibly what is going on here. There's other things that worry me. There's the lack of consistent, strong denials. I did not murder Sophie. Not present in a lot of what he said. I did not like the fact that his story changed as we listened to some of the more recent audio, and I did not like that line, if I had nothing to do with the thing I was being accused of. The if raised a lot of worry for me. In the interest of fairness, Ian Bailey denies murdering Sophie Toscan du Plantier. What do you think? Go to thewordsofwestcork.com and we'll go through some of the comments and questions that you leave there in the last episode of this podcast series. That's wordsofwestcork.com. Also, please have a look at neveratruerword.com. On there, you can see my books and how to decode words for truth and find out lies, and also my posts which delve into true crimes past and present, the news, celebrities and more. neveratruerword.com. Next time on the Words of West Cork, we're going to look at Marie Farrell. Now, Marie is a very interesting character. She claims at times to be a witness to some things that went on, and at other times she knows nothing about what went on. She's changed her story a lot. What's her truth? Where are her lies? If you want to have a look at her words before you hear the analysis, look at wordsofwestcork.com. And in episode 2, we'll listen to the words of Marie Farrell.